And here is part 2 of Harmony and the Kludge. We're talking about kludges. In abstract games, you can still have a kludge, but it's less obvious than if it were a model. There's no model or theme, quote-unquote, to help you see the context, because abstracts are, in a sense, collections of mechanics. Nonetheless, you can have a mechanic that doesn't fit with the rest, that doesn't mix well, or doesn't seem to have a useful function, or it clearly should have been replaced with something else, or it should have been removed from the game. That's a kludge, even in an abstract. Where do kludges come from? Well, they're added to games, often to solve a problem that's appeared in testing. Or perhaps the designer realized there would be a problem and added it before the testing. Most of the time, though, it's added to fix a demonstrated flaw. But at other times, it's in the game because the designer liked it, and even though it doesn't fit with what he ended up with, he isn't willing to take it out. He isn't willing to shoot his baby. It could be the original idea, and yet the game has developed in another way. Well, at that point, the designer should shoot the original. Should get it out of there. But it's hard for a designer to do. Now some examples of kludges. Catan, which used to be known as Settlers of Catan. Both the robber and the monopoly cards. Now, keep in mind there's not a lot of interaction in Catan between the players except for the trading, and there's very little you can do to actually hinder another player. I think the designer saw that, and he decided to add the robber, which has nothing to do with the rest of the game, doesn't fit at all in any way, shape, or form, in order to provide a way for a player to hinder another player, or at least have the potential to hinder another player. It has nothing to do with a settling model. Then the monopoly card is something that takes all the resources from all the players and puts them into the hand of the player who played the monopoly card. Well, then you have to trade if you want to get those resources. And I think the designer added that card to make people trade, because in some groups there's not much trading. It depends on the group. And of course, Catan is supposed to be a game about trading, but I've seen many players who don't trade much. Now, of course, it is much more of a trading game than Monopoly, but Monopoly is a really weak design. Settlers of Catan obviously is very popular and is a decent design, although technically speaking it has these kludges. How about Risk, the US pre-2008 version? Not the one with the missions. Some of those earlier versions had mission cards, but they didn't work. In 2008, Risk was revised with missions to make it a quite different game. In Risk, US, the territory cards are kludges in two senses. First, they were an artificial method, and by artificial I mean there's no correspondence with reality, of encouraging players to attack, because you have to conquer a territory to get a card. It was something to try to discourage turtling, which is quite common in Risk. Second, when you turn the cards in for armies, that's there to bring the game to a conclusion, because you have an increasing number of armies and they can get very large. The game is pretty long as is, but it's very long without increasing numbers of armies, which I have played a number of times. Instead of going up to 50 armies and more, I go 468, 468, 468, but it makes it a very long game. So, two kludges to solve problems in the game. The game didn't naturally come to a conclusion. The game didn't naturally encourage people to attack. And so the cards were put there for those purposes. Now let's take the video games World of Tanks and World of Warships. Now in big video games like this, both Harmony and the kludge become obscured. We could probably say that it's easier to make a harmonious game that's relatively small and focused, rather than it's quite big. In World of Tanks, the entire idea of 15 versus 15 randomly assigned teams is a kludge in the sense that it has nothing to do with real warfare, but it's necessary to make the online game practical. In World of Warships, the overall kludge is to play in a small area, usually amongst lots of islands, which are places where in the real world battleships and aircraft carriers virtually never went. And in both games we have the bizarre mix of nationalities of equipment, German and French and English and Russian tanks all on the same side, and possibly 15 different tanks on a team. It's also a necessary kludge, but has nothing to do with reality. And so World of Tanks breaks down, and World of Warships breaks down as models of reality. They're not. Now let's take a tabletop game, Eclipse, which is ostensibly a Eurofied 4X space game. It seems to me that it's actually almost a war game, almost an exploration game, and almost this, almost that, but ultimately unsatisfactory. The major kludge in the game is that players are awarded hidden value points for fighting. Fighting early on tends to give you higher value points because you draw a number of pieces and then throw away the ones you want and keep the higher ones. Especially if you fight repeatedly, because you get to draw again whenever you fight. I think this was added to when the rest of the game resulted in little fighting, because people didn't gain enough from fighting. What they were likely to lose was more than they were willing to risk for the possible gain. So the victory points were added. Well, rewards for fighting make no sense in the 4X model, or any model really. You gain experience when you fight, but you lose a lot of ships and people. And that experience in the overall context should not be worth a lot of victory points. I watched a game recently, I don't play Eclipse, where about half of the overall points for 5 of the 6 players came from fighting awards, which is ridiculous. They were roughly equal to the points for holding the solar systems that had been discovered. Well, in the long run, what do you think is more important? Wars are economic, after all. There are other flaws in the game. For example, the results of exploration are that space is mostly impassable. I think that's deliberate, but it doesn't fit one's idea of space. And that makes the extermination part ineffective, even with the fighting points. So I think there are a lot of kludges in Eclipse. Now, how do you recognize a kludge? Well, I'd say it's easier to find things you think are kludges in a game you don't like than in one you do like. Also, we have the limitation that some designers of puzzle-like games, whether they're single-player video games or solo tabletop games or cooperative games, tend to add things to make the puzzle solution more difficult. I come in heavily on the side of this motto: a designer knows he has achieved perfection not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And I think that is an alternative definition of harmony. Given that motto, I see many of those additions that puzzle makers make as kludges. This is not something you can rigidly define or easily pin down. It requires self-critical thinking. Good luck.